I guess first up, how did you begin writing about the Chamberlain case?
Well, I was assigned to it in about September 1980. That's about a month after the thing happened, and I I got an interview with Lindy at Mount Isa, and I wrote a sympathetic story about her and about the experiences of the family in Mount Isa. I was assigned to it from then on.
So can you tell me, just paint a picture, how often did you have to file a story on the Chamberlains? What was it like back then, 1980s, typical newsroom?
Well, it was spasmodic. It depended on what was happening. I attended the first inquest in December of 1980 with Dennis Barrett, and in January 1980. And from then on, it was spasmodic through 1981. Then it started to heat up after Professor Cameron came in with his report to the Northern Territory, and the police opened the investigation, and then everything was leaked out. All the substantial allegations in the Cameron report were leaked out to the media, including the theory of decapitation. And I was very busy writing about those sorts of things. In the second inquest, they'd been virtually condemned, virtually convicted. I was it's during the first week of the second inquest in 1981, late 1981, I started to wave a little bit. But then I formed the view that the Chamberlains were being very, very seriously oppressed, that they had the resources of an entire state against them, that the Northern Territory government had left no stone unturned. They'd put experts from all over Australia and from overseas to deal with what was essentially just a case of infanticide, for which some mothers don't even go to jail. Here it was the resources of the state being used to crack a tiny little peanut, being these tiny little individual husband and wife. And I thought just that alone suggests that I should look more closely at their side of things. And I wrote an article, I think, midway through the second inquest, which I think was the only article in Australia supporting them, which I pointed that out, that there was far too much effort going into it. They had a superintendent of police, chief superintendent, I think. He was handling the exhibits, and they made sure everything was covered, even an entomologist to make a study of what blowflies got up to with a spot of blood in the Central Australian desert. They were out to, this is a case in which they're going to show their capacity to solve a crime. And it seemed to me, even then, that the desire to demonstrate that overrode considerations of the question of whether the Chamberlains were guilty at all.
Malcolm, you mentioned that at one point you were wavering in your beliefs about the Chamberlains' innocence. Can you tell me the reasons why you felt that way?
Well, I felt that way simply because the evidence came out that there was blood found in the Chamberlain's car, and that the blood had fetal hemoglobin, which can only be found in a very young baby, which seemed to support the police theory that the baby had been murdered in the car, stuffed away in the car, perhaps in the camera bag, and that the Chamberlains had later disposed of it. Being objective as I was, I could not overlook that.
What sort of, taking you back to those early days in the 1980s, what sort of pressures and challenges did journalists face back then when they were reporting stories, and certainly one of this magnitude as it came to be?
Well, there was the competition with everyone scrambling, climbing over everyone else to get a story. There was a bit of backstabbing, a bit of bickering, a bit of betrayal, and a bit of trickery. There was the constant demand of the media organisations to get the story no matter what. And there was also the eternal problem of the journalist of sticking a nose in where you're not wanted. The Chamberlains did not want these continual intrusions into their privacy. At one point, the Chamberlains, before the second inquest started, the Chamberlains were up in Coorambung under a state of siege, with the media camped on the road outside, even helicopters pursuing them as they went down the road to do shopping. And you had to do that because you were in competition with the other media. That was a hateful aspect of it. But that's a challenge today as it is then. Was it then? It's not much different.
So not a lot has changed in that regard in terms of stalking, I suppose, interview subjects?
No, there's not at all. That's the journalist's job in life. If you, as my father once said, when I started out in this game, that if you haven't not prepared to be thrown down a flight of stairs occasionally and told something about your parentage, and you haven't got a thick skin, well, forget about it. That's your job. You're required to be polite. You're never to stand over people, but you're meant to be persistent. And if someone takes a shot at you, you've got to cop it sweet.
What sort of effect did the Chamberlain case have on, in terms of sales for the newspapers that you were writing for? Can you tell me a bit about that, whether it dramatically affected the circulation statistics?
Well, I can't really, I don't really, figures don't come to mind, but the tabloid newspapers, you must remember that by the 1980s, the tabloid newspapers were in serious trouble. The Sun newspaper in Sydney only had, I think, 7 years to go before it closed down. The Mirror was going to last a little longer, but not too much longer. And the afternoon newspapers were ready to grab anything. It's a bit like this phone hacking scandal in the United Kingdom. This really is a symptom of the desperation of newspapers to keep going in the face of this electronic revolution, which includes the internet. Even then, the Sun and the Mirror were in intense competition. When the Chamberlains were convicted, and Lindy was dispatched to life imprisonment, and Michael had to come up the following Saturday morning, and the judge gave him a suspended sentence, and Michael cried, and I think it was a terrible emotional thing. I went outside, and there was the Sun and the Mirror with cars ready to pursue Michael wherever he went. But that was a case where you've got to do it. If the Sun gets it and the Mirror hasn't got it, the Mirror reporter's in trouble. And I'm quite sure that these did give sales to the tabloid newspapers, if not the morning papers as well. And I did note that of the two afternoon newspapers, the Mirror was the most aggressive. The Sun had a little bit of more soul, and when the Royal Commission came along, which didn't produce anything like the same headlines, the Sun did cover it. The Mirror didn't give it a word, because the Mirror was desperate, was much more ruthless, and much more. And in fact, in the end, it outlasted the Sun, but it did it by ruthlessness.
Just on that topic too, the intrusiveness of the media, I was talking to a West Australian journalist who said that there was some sort of gentleman's agreement between the journalists in Darwin at the time, they were covering the trial, that they were not to touch the Chamberlains, they were not to follow them, tailgate them once they left that courtroom. So basically that sounds a bit bogus. Do you know of any such agreement?
No, I think that was largely observed. I think that the Chamberlains were under the protection of Pastor Graham Olson, who was the Seventh-day Adventist pastor. They lived in his house, and I think there was a general feeling that the Chamberlains should be left alone. I don't think it was observed to the absolute letter, but I did. I noticed that the photographers went around them when they went home, and I think that was fair enough. I think there was a gentleman's agreement.
Why do you believe the Chamberlains were so willing to talk to the press in the hours after Azaria's disappearance? Why do you think they were so complicit in agreeing to the media's demands?
Well, all I can say about that is that there's no law saying how people should react to traumatic circumstances. People react in many different ways, sometimes strange ways, but there's no rule. That might look a bit funny, a bit odd, but you've an example of a father runs over his child when he reverses his car in the some people hysterical, some people calm, some people spiritual. There's all sorts of ways, and just because someone doesn't react the way that you think they should react doesn't mean anything. The Chamberlains were people of God, that Michael was a Christian minister. They believed that the soul only sleeps, and that the parents and children are reunited at the time of the second coming. Well, they believed that. So that was part of it. You must remember that Michael, being a pastor, would have prayed every day. And there was a spiritual side to him, a spiritual side to Lindy. She was a pastor's daughter of Pastor Murchison, Cliff Murchison. There was this a spiritual element about them as well, and you've got to take that into account.
I'd just like to ask you, there were accusations made against Lindy that she was, if you might remember, I think it was an interview with one of the commercial channels where she described how the dingo pulls back the skin of the prey, and why were they so willing to talk about this in the press?
Well, again, as all I can repeat is that there was no rule to say you shouldn't do that. It sounded very odd. It sounded callous, and it was off-putting. And I think it's a media interview that Lindy regretted ever having done, because it turned them on terribly. But I say there's no rule that people react however people react. They were just a couple who were selected by fate to go through this terrible trauma, and they weren't well prepared for it. That's all I can say about that.
They certainly weren't media savvy at that point in time, and
I think that there was a streak of vanity about them. That Lindy was very attractive, very sexy. She was quite slim in those days, and very beautiful eyes, and attractive clothing, and very nice looking. And Michael was rather a pin-up boy himself, and they were a pretty couple. And I think they were a little bit conscious of that. And I think Lindy realised she was the centre of attention and played up to it a little bit as well. She was turned out in different clothes. Sometimes she had bobby socks on and she was at school, looked like a little schoolgirl. The other times in a glamorous evening dress and lipstick. And she deliberately played that up to this hilt. Michael always wanted slim, attractive women around him, and when Lindy got pregnant at the time of the trial, he was rather put off her because she was too fat. So it was they were physically very conscious of all that, and Michael only ever wanted slim blonde women. Yeah, so there was that element about them.
Malcolm, what was it about the Chamberlain case that so captured the public and the media's imagination?
Well, there was several elements. One was the exotic location. It was Ayers Rock with an element of mystery about it, with Aboriginal mythology. It was a little bit of the Death on the Nile experience, a crime, or an alleged crime, in an exotic location. There was Lindy Chamberlain, who was very, very sexy and attracted all the male interest. There was a Seventh-day Adventism, which was poorly understood. It was a New World religion, which is confused with Jehovah's Witnesses and other faiths, and even wrong ideas that it was related to witchcraft and so on. All that was surrounded as well. It was the enigmatic behaviour of the Chamberlains, and also the national ridicule of the idea of a dingo taking a baby. Now all those things. Principally, I think it was centred on Lindy. Those were the elements that attracted the public attention.
And as far as the reason for the continuing interest in the Chamberlain case?
Well, simply because it was a controversial case. The trial was held. The verdict didn't satisfy everyone. There was a continuing controversy about it. There was a continuing questions raised, and I was part of that campaign. And finally the Royal Commission, and the result, which exonerated them but did not remove all doubts at all. There was a tremendous unwillingness of the Northern Territory government to undo the effects of a properly constituted judicial process, to the extent that they opposed the application of the Chamberlains to quash the convictions. And John Lowndes, the third coroner in 1995, who declined to say that a dingo had done the deed. He left the verdict open. So all those elements there were meant that the public still remained intrigued.
And in your mind, what explains that resistance to actually find that a dingo took Azaria, and in fact substantiate what Coroner Dennis Barrett had said back in 1981? Simply
because they had been through the whole police investigation, second coroner's inquest, gone through a properly constituted trial. The Chambers had been found guilty. They'd gone through the entire appeal process to the federal court and to the High Court, which had upheld the convictions. And as far as the Northern Territory is concerned, well, if you're going to let the mob, clamour from the mob, undo a properly constituted court verdict, then how can we say that all the other convictions should remain? The system allowed for reasonable doubt. The system allowed for a court to find that a verdict was unsafe. The system allowed an appeal court to take in new evidence. Now, all that was done. finally a Royal Commission found that there was reasonable doubt. But why should the whole of the system be unravelled just because a verdict, you can't hold the verdict didn't stand up. You can't hold over the heads of a judicial system the prospect of massive payouts and rolling of heads should they be wrong, because judicial systems have to make decisions.
However fallible they might be.
Well, that's right, and the courts have been fallible throughout the course of history. But wherever you have two assertions, one saying he done it, the other I didn't done it, you've got to resolve it somehow. And back in the medieval times, it was trial by combat, trial by fire, trial by immersion, and in this case, it's a jury trial, which is regarded as the best way of resolving a conflict, but it cannot. The only safeguard is beyond reasonable doubt, and even then the system can be wrong. The only way you can have a perfect system is if everyone who went before a court was given a truth drug and couldn't help but tell the truth. Then you'd solve it.
I think it's interesting that at the trial there was an alternative hypothesis, or what sort of two hypotheses. It was either Lindy or it was the dingo. No other version was allowed to enter into the jury's mind or to be suggested. Is that a usual practice with legal process, that it's either this or it's that?
No, I think this was two hypotheses which arrived at on the basis of the facts available. What else could have happened? The baby was in the tent. The parents knew the baby was in the tent. The baby was heard crying in the tent. Then the dingo was allegedly seen. Then the baby was no longer there. The dingo took it, or else something happened. What else could have happened? Would you have had a margin creep up under the tent? Would you have had a squirrel burrow from under the ground? Would you have had the baby zapped into outer space? The only other possible hypothesis was that the Chamberlains were involved in the death of their baby. But that doesn't. In other situations, there can be oodles of different. The disimage of little girl Madeleine McCann in Europe, there were all sorts of hypotheses there. One, the parents did it. The other, that someone pinched the baby. One, that the baby wandered into a canal. One that was pinched by a paedophile. You don't know. But here, it seemed, on the facts available, there are only two hypotheses.
Or I suppose one of the other hypotheses that I'm not sure that it was raised in court, but certainly was a rumour in the territory at the time, that one of the Chamberlain's sons was somehow involved and Lindy was part of the cover-up.
Well, that was a horrible assertion, and it was raised by Jenkins, and one of the judges in the federal court who raised that. But one of the kids did it. But if you look at the actual facts of where the children were and the time, you couldn't have been it. What you had was that I think the little Aidan, who was 6 years old, was with his parents standing outside the tent. Regan was in the tent asleep. Now the dingo got in through the unzipped tent took the baby and got out again. Now Regan was about 3 years old. Could you imagine a 3-year-old doing it? A baby. And there's no evidence of the baby. There's no evidence he was and little Aidan wasn't even there. And as the judge pointed out, the baby cried out, and it was heard by independent witnesses. I think the Lows and the Wests, the two salt of the earth witnesses who were there, who heard the baby cry. So if the baby cried and Aidan was with the Chambers, he couldn't have done it. And then little Regan was a 3-year-old. Well, could Regan have done it? Where was the weapon? Oh, you couldn't. There's no blood in the tent. There's no blood on Regan. So who did it? Couldn't have been.
Oh, I agree. It's totally ludicrous, but I suppose it's an example or an illustration of the maliciousness that was surrounding theories about Azaria's disappearance.
Yes, and that particular malicious thought has deeply affected Aidan as he's grown up. He's now a young man in his 30s and married and living in Western Australia, but he's had to live with that all his life, that he might have murdered his baby sister. Totally untrue, totally unfounded. There was not a shred of evidence that he had anything to do with it.
I guess how much pressure was on you to find or to write your copy to suggest that Lindy was guilty? I mean, were there any newsroom pressures on you to write a certain way?
No. I was left entirely. It was entirely in my hands, and I took a pro Chamberlain line and the Herald followed me all the way through. There was no pressure at all. What of the pressure I got was from the copy takers. When I dictated my copy, at the end of it they were saying, "Did you do it? Did you do it?" And one case I read a colour story for the Sun Herald, and I wrote about all the material objects that had been mentioned in the evidence: the tent pegs, the tent flaps, the baby's jumpsuit, this, that, and the other thing, torches, bobby socks, shoes. Now, the copy taker took all that down, but she spent torches, Tortures, in the middle of all those objectives. The word torches got in, and it went all the way through, because that was subjectively, she was looking for something about, and it was a nonsense. It was quickly recognised and picked up, but it did. There was, even the copy takers, there was a feeling that she had done it. So, but there was no pressure from me. The Herald left the whole thing into my hands.
To their credit.
Yes, well, I followed that and followed it all the way through, and I just, in the end, I was picking the right horse.
Was there pressure on other journalists from News Limited tabloids to report the case in a certain way?
No, I don't think so. I think the news organisation will simply leave the coverage to the reporter. He knows more about it. He's on the shop floor. He's on the front line. They take his, as they always do. They always take the reporter's view. I think that in the case of Mike Lester, who was Channel 9 journalist, he was deemed eventually to become too close to the Chamberlains. He was regarded as a friend of theirs, and they took him off, and they took another journalist, his name is Flannery. They took him on, and he took a much harder line. He wasn't anti-Chamberlain, he just took a much tougher line, and they took Mike off because he had become too close to them, and that is a danger, and I was aware of the danger that I might be deemed to be too close. So I, from time to time, I threw in an article that was contrary to the interests of the Chamberlains to keep yourself poles apart, to pole apart from them. Michael invited me to go on a jog with him one morning during the second inquest. So going jogging with the Chambers was the big social, the huge social, ultimate social compliment. And I was there, and I went and I was Chamberlain. It was the ultimate social compliment, and I wrote it all up on the Saturday morning. I waited 3 days, and it was such a good colour story that I wrote it up, and Michael was furious over that, but I had to talk my way out of it somehow. But I did it because I'm not meant to be a friend of his. I was meant to be a journalist, and the same time I wrote a couple of critical things about him, mocking him a little bit, just to keep arm's distance and not to be great. And at the end, in 1994, they had a sort of a party at Coonamung where they brought all the people who'd been in favour of them, all the people that supported them, the huge community groups that supported them. I wasn't invited until the very end, when pressure was put on to them to invite me. But I regard that as a compliment, because if I been the first one they invited, I didn't want to know about it. And in the end, they had all the people there in 1994, the whole mob there for an hour waiting for the Chamberlains. And the Chamberlains, some of them would come into state. And then after an hour, the Chamberlains casually walked in like the royal couple. And with them was Mike Lester, who had been with them for an hour talking to them. Well, that's not my scene. Mike Lester, who's with them for an hour while everyone was waiting, that's going too far. You're their friend, you're in their pocket, you're never going to say anything against them. And if I wasn't invited and I was in their favour, well, that's a compliment to me.
Did you ever correspond with the Chamberlains on a personal level, perhaps later on?
Yes, I did, and one time in 1986, it must have been, I'd been after the failure of the High Court appeal, and I went up to the Northern Territory for something, and I had a briefing from the Chief Minister at Tuxworth, and his media secretary told me that they said that that every bit of agitation down here means Lindy is in for another 6 months. We'd like to release her as a pardon, but we're not going to do that until such time as everyone shuts up. And Tuxworth said, yes, that's right, we cannot let the mob tell us how to run our court system. And at that stage I had been given up hope, and I saw that Lindy was suffering in this dreadful place, this cage, and this is Berrima, the women's compound, and the flatlands on the outskirts of Darwin, a sort of flat, hot, stinking, swampy place, and with the female flotsam of the Northern Territory, just tough shop breakers, and they were keeping Lindy in, and everyone was, and I thought, well, maybe one of the children was suffering, and poor little Regan, he was in the backyard playing with other kids. Someone threw a bottle in the fire. The bottle exploded and a shaft of glass went through Regan's eye and blinded him in that eye. And I'm sure that had Lindy had been home supervising them, that would not have happened. It's a theoretical thing, but counterfactual, you might say. But I saw this terrible suffering for Lindy, and the family suffering. And I finally wrote to Michael and said, "Look, just get him out. Accept the verdict, formally accept she's been found guilty. Get her out, and then campaign for the innocence." Well, at that point, I had gone over the mark. I was telling a party in a dispute what to do, and Michael took grave exception to it. And he publicised that, and I had to say, "Well, I'm sorry, I was too close. I was profoundly depressed." And I believed that just the most imperative thing was to get Lindy out. And in fact, Michael was correct that she should stay there in order to put maximum pressure on the Northern Territory government. Not long after that, the baby's matinee jacket was found at the base of Ayers Rock, and at that point, the resolve of the Northern Territory government had been so eroded by all that agitation and all the new stuff that came out, and particularly the scientific stuff, that they collapsed, and they said, "Righto, well, let's have a Royal Commission." So at that point, that's a letter I regret having written, but you do get personally, you get dragged into it, you get drawn into it. I've had infrequent contact, very little contact with Lindy, because she's behind a barricade now. You've got to charge us for interviews. Michael I've been very close to, and he regards me as a friend now, and there's no reason why he can't be a friend now that the case is over. He did write a book on his case, which is Heart of Stone, which has not been published simply because it's too late, I think. Maybe he'll find a publisher, but I edited it for him, and he got someone else to do some more substantial editing. But I can ring him any time now, and he rings me, has been to me home, so we're friends, but that's after the formalities are over. So I've been in touch with them one way or the other.
Would it be hard not to get so involved with the case too, given that you were at the first inquest, the second inquest, the trial, and then this part of the subsequent appeals?
I went to the Federal Court appeal in Sydney, and I didn't go to the High Court appeal, but I was up in Darwin when the High Court made its judgment, because we'd been tipped off that they might be acquitted, and it came very close. It was a 3-2 decision. While I was up there, a Northern Territory policeman told friendly journalists that he was going to get me that night, beat me up, and throw me into jail. I didn't know about that. I had left Sydney when the verdict came out that upholding the convictions. I left that afternoon. Otherwise, I would have had a nasty encounter.
Wouldn't it be quite difficult not to get so involved with the Chamberlains,
yes,
because you were at every single court process?
Yes, well, one of the editors told me that he would have replaced me halfway through because I'd become too involved, and he would have put another journalist on, which is a matter for him. But if it's a case of catch-22, really, you might do that with a journalist, but then you lose all the background knowledge that he has, and they chose not to replace me. But certainly I was involved, and it had an emotional effect on me, and I was quite... they could well have replaced me.
I guess in what way do you think that the story was sensationalised in the press?
Well, it was sensationalised in that there were leaks out. For example, in all the media, the supposed bloodied handprint on the jumpsuit was telecast on Channel 9 by Mike Lester. He publicised that. It was leaked out to them. I know that in the lead up to the second inquest, that one of the Deputy Police Commissioner, Bill Allen, who was then in terrible trouble professionally, he wanted to curry favour with the media, and he rang us up and he told us that news had come through to them. Information came through the Chamberlain's car was swimming with baby's blood, and all that stuff was. And then, of course, if there's no break like that, then you'd see headlines like "The Agony of the Chamberlains" and anything at all. And in fact, one Sun reporter had published a whole interview with Michael Chamberlain, which he had never given. It was totally fabricated. Michael told me later that he didn't say a word, didn't even speak to the reporter. So there was all that sensational stuff as well. The false information came out that Azaria meant sacrifice in the wilderness. That all became headlines. The possibility of the baby had been decapitated, which came from the Cameron report, was publicised. So it was all that stuff came out as well.
Where did the rumours come from? Were they from Mount Isa or from the Northern Territory? Or?
Well, there was various sources, but the Azaria sacrifice in the wilderness came from someone who looked up a book on, I think, Hebrew names, I'm not sure, of children and got the wrong name. I think it meant blessed of God. It didn't mean sacrifice in the wilderness. But the various things came through like that. For example, and things were built up that Lindy was wheeling Azaria through the shopping centre at Mount Isa as a tiny baby, and the baby took a tumble from the stroller and fell on the ground and cried, and Lindy picked up and put it back. And that got around, and by the time it reached me, that Lindy had spear tackled the baby into the floor of the shopping centre. So there was of course a huge amount of invention. The fellow who gave me that information said that the baby had the baby had needed a blood transfusion, that the Seventh-day Adventists did not believe in blood transfusion. The baby had died, and then there was a conspiracy by Seventh-day Adventists to take a doll to Ayers Rock and have say that a dingo had taken the baby. But that was just nonsense, and all that stuff. Those stories floated around, all sorts of stories floated around, which are nonsense.
Did members of the press make up interviews? Make up rumours?
No, I don't think they. No, I don't think there was a few fun stories going around between us. One was the AC theory. The AC theory is that the name that AC kept cropping up all the way through. There was Alice Lynn Chamberlain, there was Aidan Chamberlain, there was Ayers Rock, Alice Springs, or Alice with an A on the C. Amanda Cranwell, the little girl who was attacked by a dingo 6 weeks before Azaria died, and various other. The AC theory went on and on and on. There was Avis Murchison, the A and a C appearing there, the mother, and it was just on and on and on. But they were just that was just a joke. But Ayers Rock had an A and a C, but that was just a playing with words. But even there was one fellow who invented a whole thesis on wordplay and sent it across to Professor Cameron. And Professor Cameron sent a message back saying, "I'd be delighted to keep it with my personal file," which is all sort of tongue-in-cheek. And that gave the green light to this character. And he sent theses till finally Cameron had to beg him to stop. But all this sort of stuff went on. Yeah.
I guess all that was missing was the DC on the AC.
Yeah, that's right.
In terms of adding sensationalism to the case, Coroner Barrett's decision to televise the findings back in 1981, how much do you think that contributed?
I think that contributed an awful amount, because Dennis Barrett was scathingly critical of the Northern Territory Police and their forensic service and of the Rangers. It particularly hit the police very, very hard, and it also stung Kenneth Brown, who was a forensic odontologist, and you have Dennis Barrett saying to the nation over here that it was dangerous to accept Brown's evidence because he had admitted that he had no experience of bite marks through clothing. And Kenneth, who was a Seventh-day Adventist incidentally, but quite a prominent odontologist, was stung, and he asked the Northern Territory Police whether he could take the jumpsuit across to London to show it to Professor Cameron. And it was Professor Cameron's report, trying to solve a crime like a supposed crime 20,000 kilometres away on the basis of some stains on a jumpsuit, kicked the whole thing off. So it was Dennis Barrett, and of course the police felt humiliated nationally. When the second inquest came along with all this murder theory apparently well established, the police nickname for Barrett was Dingaling Dennis. because they were quite pleased then that they'd had, and not only that, but of course everyone's professionalism became involved, and that all the way through the trial everyone was supporting their own people. You had, because forensic odontology was part of the Crown case, when the Chamberlain's conviction was announced, there was a convention of dentists which cheered, and some stood up and clapped because their own person was involved, and all that sort of stuff. And one of the reasons that all the forensic scientists fought hard to protect their reputation as opposed to looking objectively at the evidence.
Egos made and broken as a result of the case.
Yes, although I'm not saying that I'm not want to defame them by saying that they were prepared to cast objectivity aside, but certainly there was an ego element all the way through. For example, Malcolm Chaikin, who just died, he advanced a theory, I think before the second inquest, that, or might have been the first, that tufts of baby's jumpsuit indicated that a bladed instrument had been used to make the abrasions in the jumpsuit, because nothing other than a bladed instrument could produce tufts. After that, some amateur scientists in Kurenbong with a domestic dog conducted an experiment with a jumpsuit, and the dog's canine teeth produced perfect tufts. Not only that, but it transpired that anything could produce tufts, even rubbing the jumpsuit against metal could produce tufts, and it was totally discredited. That was then taken to Chaikin, who dismissed it out of hand, wouldn't listen to it. And when he found himself to be under siege, he then reverted to deep science and got a scanning electron microscope to work on the ends of the tissues in the jumpsuit to show that a planar array had been formed which could not produce by anything but a bladed instrument. And he tried to battle his way through and to fight for the fact that he had been wrong, to fight for it and say that he had been right. There had to be a bladed instrument. And but the one thing that he couldn't get over was the fact that he'd said that tufts was the clearest indication that a bladed instrument was used, and that was quite false. I mentioned that in a speech or address I gave to a forensic science body, I think 1 or 2 years ago, and didn't realise Chaikin was in the audience. He was a little upset, but that's
probably what killed him.
No, it may have killed him, but that's the guts of it. Everyone was prepared to. And Joy Curl, for example, she made a complete botch of it. I'm prepared to say that, a complete botch of it, in that it turned out there was no blood in the baby's car, no blood in the car, that. Or so little as to be incidental, like a cut finger or some bleeding nose, but none of the blood that was described. It was found that it was sticky substances like apple juice or spilt apple juice or spilt caramel milkshake that attracted copper oxide dust, and copper oxide dust produced a positive result for an orthotolidine test for the presumptive presence of blood. So there was copper oxide dust everywhere in Mount Isa. It was everywhere. And that was what the supposed spray pattern on the dashboard had been produced was bituminous sound deadener, which had been sprayed under the car during manufacture and had come up through a little aperture in the floor, which was meant to have been plugged, but the workmen were lazy and didn't plug it, and that went up, and then that sticky substance attracted copper oxide dust, and it was that was supposed to be the blood, but of course couldn't have been blood, because had it been blood, by the time it was found by a forensic policeman, Jim Medcalf, a year after the baby disappeared, he said it's sticky to the touch. Well, that meant it couldn't be blood, because blood dries in a few minutes, and by a year it would have been just dust. On a vinyl surface, couldn't possibly be blood. So that was all nonsense. And now Joy Curl was totally discredited over that. The Northern Territory took her up into their own fold, took her up to the Northern Territory, and they kept her there as a forensic scientist, and she no doubt did some very good work. The final summary of Joy was that she went beyond her expertise, and she had pressure to perform, and she went beyond her knowledge. And she did no doubt very good work. And when she was called to New South Wales to answer questions on a case she'd covered previously in her role here in New South Wales, the Northern Territory paid her entire fare to come down to give evidence and then go back again. So they were exceedingly good to her because she was their champion. And of course the Northern Territory I asked. I met Kenneth Brown years after the verdict, and he said to me it was politics. It was politics. If there's politics involved, no people will believe anything. And he wasn't going to give away nobody was going to go anywhere. Professor Cameron was brought over the Royal Commission, and he was asked about it, and he said that he believed there'd been a murder and still did. And no one was prepared to sacrifice, to give an inch on anything. And one prominent lawyer who'd been associated strongly with the Crown side of the case, when he was asked at the end of the Royal Commission, what do you think now about Lindy's guilt or innocence, he said, I couldn't care if Azaria walked into the courtroom now, I'd still say the bitch was guilty. Now, I won't say who that lawyer was, but he was a lawyer who had gave advice at one stage to the Crown. But that showed just how pig-headed people become because their own reputation is on the line, and that's one of the great values of our profession of journalism, that you're able to stand aside from that and try to be objective. But of course, the Northern Territory, you go up there and you mention Azaria Chamberlain, it's a red flag to a bull. A lot of them will still say that the bitch did it, and there's still people around here who say she did it. But there's no. You've got to be a little bit objective.
And as far as Kuhl's concerned, I mean, she didn't follow correct scientific procedure by destroying the test plates.
No, that is incorrect. At that stage, it was procedure to destroy the test plates. That was since brought in after. Joy she did carry out scientific discipline, and she was supervised by Dr. Simon Baxter, who was a well-qualified forensic biologist. She did all that, but she was simply going into what they call tiger country, which is an area where you're dealing with, if it had been bloodstains at all, are very severely denatured, meaning they'd rotted away, difficult to find anything. And it was the era before DNA, which would have been vastly helped them. And she was simply led astray. She took it was blood, and then she did this octoloni test to see the presence of fetal hemoglobin, and the results she interpreted to show the presumptive presence of blood. But by that stage, she was out on a limb, and she was dealing with the unknown. That was essentially the problem.
We've talked a little bit about what the atmosphere was like in the newsroom back in the 1980s, but just to take you to the second inquest and the trial, what was the atmosphere like in the media room? Because I understand you weren't actually in the courtroom per se.
Yes, I was. I did the whole of the trial in the courtroom. The other journalists, most of the other journalists, were in a media room, but I worked apart from them. I didn't stay in the same hotel. I stayed apart from them, and I was with the chambers right behind the scene all through the trial. What the atmosphere? All I can say of the atmosphere from the start, as I've said many times before, on the very first day when the exhibits were shown to the presented to the court by the Crown. He was an exhibit of the dingo. Here was a photo of the dingo. Here's a photo of the dingo blown up, and it was the double meaning that sent the jury into fits of laughter. And there I realised then that the jury had probably made up its mind, the fact they were taking it so lightly, they were supposed to keep to themselves, talk to no one about it. In fact, some of them were yapping all through Darwin. I had a couple of friends who knew them and were talking to them each weekend, and I had a little line into the media room, into the jury room, and I knew what was going on. I knew after the Crown had finished its case that the jury had convicted them, and was only interested in just hearing what the defence had to say. Barry Botcher, who was a highly qualified biologist who was retained by the defence. It was an unfortunate courtroom manner, far too difficult and complicated in his explanations. Didn't give a great impression on the witness box, but still a highly qualified, intelligent man. But the jury's attitude was, or the jury's statement, I found it was, he's an idiot. Well, he wasn't an idiot at all, but that was their dismissal of him. And it's just unfortunate that a lot of the defence witness, forensic experts, were rather a little bit uppity and a bit precious. And Barker was able to say, well, my Crown witnesses are all humble laboratory people, and they give evidence of their pretentiousness. And look at this mob from Melbourne, all their silk shirts, their silk-shirted lawyers, and all the ivory tower academics, who are you going to believe? In fact, it turns out the Ivory Tower academics were right, but that didn't create a great impression on the jury. So the atmosphere in the courtroom was, it was all hung around the jury, all revolved around the jury. When the Chambers were convicted, when the jury came in, none of them were looking at the Chamberlains. Well, that's always a sure sign they've found them guilty. And then, with the word guilty rang out, Lindy reacted as though she'd been shot. And they then the judge sentenced her to a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment with hard labour. Had no choice. And then he deferred the sentencing of Michael till the following Monday. And then it was put to him later on, after that it'd be better to do it Saturday morning. He can't have him in agony over the weekend. So they fronted him on the Saturday morning, had a special hearing, and then the judge said, I find you, sentence you, I think it was to 3 years imprisonment, or a term of imprisonment, or it might have been 18, I can't remember now. But I'm putting you on a bond of good behaviour because the children need a father. And then when it slowly, with a reconnaissance of $500, well, when that finally sunk into Michael that he was not going to go to jail, he'd been standing like a man waiting before the firing squad. And when it had been all night, he'd been tossing and turning, and when it dawned on him he was going to walk free, he broke down and cried the first time in the entire trial. And Greg Kaffner, he's now the Northern Territory coroner, but then he was a lawyer on the defence side of things. He was crying, and it was a terrible experience and terrible emotional experience. Then I think a day after that I went out to see Lindy in jail, and it was exclusive, and I expected her to be distraught, but no, she came out smiling happily, talked to me, laughing, and a couple of the prison officers standing by watching as I interviewed her, and I just talked away. And then I said, well, if you want to write to me, you can write your address on this. And then the hand reached, I'll take that, you're not going to hand any notes to Lindy. And if I'd been quick enough, I would have said, well, the escape plan is, but I didn't. But but she was laughing, giggling, and talking as though nothing happened. Well, I could have written a piece, as a tabloid journalist would have written, oh, Lindy thrown to the wolves, this stinking, but I didn't. I wrote up just exactly how she was. And that upset the Chamber of Defence totally. But I can't help it. That's the way she was, and that's the way I reported it. Then Stuart Tipple, her solicitor, was trying to get me to stir the possum about Lindy being allowed to keep her baby, Carlia, in jail when she gave birth. And I said, look, mate, I know how you feel about it, but do you put yourself in the shoes of the Northern Territory administration? Do you think for one moment the Northern Territory would allow her to keep the baby in jail when she's been convicted before the world of killing the previous baby? And suppose something did happen and the baby died of cot death or had an accident, they couldn't live with that. And Stuart said if he was objective he'd agree, but he said he can't be objective, and he was very, very upset with me. But I couldn't help that. That's just the way. You can't stir a possum over that. The baby Carlia had to be taken away. Anyway, I'm digressing a little, but that was the. Say, as a journalist covering that case, you had to sort of, from time to time, disappoint people, tread on their toes. You couldn't do anything else.
Malcolm, what about your famous response to the verdict's announcement? When
the jury was walking out, the judge had left the chamber, and I think he went up and had a third of a bottle of scotch. He was so upset by it, because he'd been advocated to the jury to find them not guilty. I mean, he'd done everything bar direct the jury to acquit, was Muirhead. But when the last juror disappeared to the jury room, I said to her, "You pack of bastards," in a slightly raised voice, and that was picked up and reported. But this was then. John Bryson asked me when he wrote his book, and I said I didn't want to know about it. I just didn't want to say it, but he said the word bastards came out, and then in the film Evil Angels, they had Tim Robertson, I think it was the actor portraying me, got up and screamed out bastards in open court, which had that happened, I would have been locked up and for contempt, but I did say that, and I was a little bit on the edge even when I did say it, because you can't have juries being abused. But I did let go of that, and that was then spread everywhere, and I've had to admit to it now, but and not proud of it. But that was partly because I didn't agree with the verdict, and partly because I didn't agree with their behaviour.
You're certainly regarded as the media authority on the Chamberlain case. You've been writing about the case for over 3 decades now. Can you tell me what have you learnt as a result of the case, and how perhaps your reports have changed, if at all?
Oh, that's a hard one. Well, what I've learnt is just that there are other occasions when the mob have turned on an individual. It came again in the Harry Blackburn case in, I think it was 1989, where the police released a press conference. Harry had been picked up for a series of rapes and robberies when Harry was totally innocent. And it was only because a skilled police officer, Clive Small, got onto the brief of evidence and realised it was no good that the whole thing was pulled. But there are many occasions when someone is convicted, and I wrote a whole book on it called Justice and Nightmares, the Splat case in South Australia, where there seems to be evidence that convicts someone, but they are innocent. And that it did teach me that circumstances can combine in such a way. This Gordon Wood case is an example where you're supposed to have objective juries, but you have a very skilled prosecutor, as Ian Barker was in the Chamberlain case, and they can swing it, and the people might be innocent. In Gordon Wood's case, it was too much of a reasonable doubt. But that's just what's just heard. That and other cases have demonstrated the law. You've got to be continually scrutinised. It's not an automatic process. You don't just close the file once someone goes before a court. You've got to keep watching to see what happens.
And do you think Australia has learnt anything, the nation, as a result?
The nation's learnt a huge amount. One is that simply tolerance. The Chamberlains were different. The person different than their reactions. There was a new world religion which is not well understood. It's a world came from America. It wasn't like Methodism or Catholicism, and that the Chamberlains just reacted differently. They were different. Their reactions at the start were unfortunate. And there's this Yahoo element in Australian society ready to condemn anyone, including migrants and anyone else who doesn't conform. And that's what is taught to Australia. I hope Australia has learned something out of that.
Was there selective leaking of information to journalists throughout the trials, and what was the motivation for doing this?
Well, it was so there was leaking before the second inquest. That was the main time. There wasn't any leaking during the trial, but in the leaking prior, because the Northern Territory Police, they had the friendly Northern Territory News, which was part of the News Limited chain. What was given to the Northern Territory News went right through the News Limited papers, which covered most of Australia. The leaking was simply was really just I'm not going to accuse the Northern Territory Police of creating a climate that was hostile to the Chamberlains, but I think that they were quite happy to have publicised the success of their investigation.
In the film Evil Angels, you see where all the helicopters come in when the when the police went to the house in Currambong in September 1981. What was happening there?
Well, I wasn't there myself, but there would have been a tip-off to the media too that they were going to make an arrest of the Chamberlains.
Do you know if there was an ongoing relationship between the Northern Territory government and all the Northern Territory Police and sections of the press at the time to report the story in a certain way?
No, I don't have any direct evidence of that, but I do know that the Northern Territory News was very close to the government and to the police. The government then was Paul Everingham's National Liberal Party, and they were very, very anti-Chamberlains, and so much so that they attacked me, that over the years when I reported, when after the Chamberlains were convicted and the Northern Territory wanted to close it down, I kept things going by reporting in the Sun Herald events that were pro-Chamberlain, because I knew the Sun Herald circulated in Darwin because of the football. And I was saying some pretty harsh things, and I was told the Northern Territory Police wanted to beat the crap out of me. They wanted to get me into a dark alley and beat me up. And so much so that I had to make a request to the Chief Minister's office to get in touch with the Police Commissioner and haul them off, because I wasn't didn't want to be put through that. But there was a very close connection with between the Northern Territory and the news and the police. And when I rang the Northern Territory News, they were very hostile. And one of the editors said, "Don't you quote me, don't you quote me." So I went and quoted him. Damn him, he's a reporter, he should be quoted. But they were so hostile. I'd drop in once, like going to Lions Den, and I was escorted out. So that was hostile at the part of the Northern Territory establishment, and that did reflect itself, in the News Limited coverage.
It's now 30 years since this has happened, 1981. Some of those things would have been coming out in the archives. Do you know of any internal Northern Territory government correspondence or pressure put on the Northern Territory Police to slam the Chamberlains?
What, from the government? Now, all I know is that by the time the second inquest came around, I think the Northern Territory government and police were persuaded that the Chamberlains were probably guilty, and the second, Jerry Galvin, was sent down there as the coroner, and he was. I'm not suggesting he wasn't objective, but I think that there was some pressure on him to just get the Chamberlains before the court, get them indicted, get them before the court. I'm not suggesting Jerry succumbed to that, but there was certainly pressure on him to get this whole thing. They had Des Sturgis, a Queensland barrister there as the counsel assisting, and Sturgis had his brief was to get them before the dock. In the dock.
To what extent were the Northern Territory authorities on a witch hunt against the Chamberlains?
Well, I don't think it was which. I think it was not so much against the Chamberlains. I think it was simply an operation to demonstrate their ability to do police work efficiently and solve a crime. The Chamberlains were virtually pawns in a power game to maintain their reputation and demonstrate the capacity of the world. It coincided with the self-consciousness of the Northern Territory about their status and the desire of Northern Territory for statehood, and they wanted to show this. Was showing that they weren't a backwoods, but they were a properly efficient, scientifically based police force, and they could conduct an inquiry like this. So the Chamberlains were really pawns in the whole process.
Was it a matter of trying to protect tourism to Ayers Rock when the government had just spent a huge amount of money on the Ulara resort?
That might have been a factor, but I don't think a very important one. I don't think that was terribly important at all.
What motive did the Northern Territory government have in wanting to convict Lindy?
Again, I don't think you're talking about a government as against an individual or a couple of individuals. The couple of individuals don't matter to governments. It was what they represented that mattered. And again, what they represented was the efficiency of the Northern Territory and its police force and forensic establishment. That's what mattered. The Chamberlains were incidental.
What did the Northern Territory Police believe? Lindy claims they were out to get her from the start. Is this justified in your experience of the case?
No, I don't think they were out to get them from the start. I think you've got to give them a little more credit on that. They were simply out. There was a mystery, and they simply wanted to solve that mystery. And they formed a belief based on Cameron's report, which was later totally discredited. If Cameron said that there'd been a murder, he was a highly regarded, internationally renowned forensic pathologist, and he said that there had been a murder and they were bound to investigate it.
Why were the findings of the first inquest overturned and a second one held?
Well, the findings of the first inquest were overturned on the basis A of the Cameron report, which said there'd been a murder, and B the findings of Joy Curl that the fetal haemoglobin had been found in the car. There was compelling evidence, seemingly compelling evidence that there had not been a dingo attack, there'd been a murder, and as such, it was necessary to hold another inquest.
Was there a political impetus to this?
I think that there was certainly Northern Territory again was felt its reputation was on the line for its efficiency of its public service and its police force. I think there was certainly a political imperative to demonstrate what they could do.
Michael Chamberlain wrote in a 1999 book called Azaria, Black Light, White Light, that as surely as Azaria was taken by a real dingo, the Chamberlains were taken down by a pack of baying journalistic dingoes and their publishers, the Adelaide News, the Sydney Sun and the Murdoch Press. Is this comment justified?
I think there was a very hostile attitude and very exploitive attitude by all those publication groups towards the Chamberlains, but they had taken a very anti-Chamberlain line. But you would call them dingoes if they're against your interests, and the Northern Territory Police had some choice things to say about me.
Why did they take such an anti-Chamberlain line?
Because I think that that was the conviction of a lot of the journalists who were associated with it. That was a conviction that they were, a lot of them were quite powerly with the police, and they formed that view.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, as I say, I think the whole thing is just a case study into how things can be blown totally out of proportion. I went to a case of infanticide on the south coast years ago, where a mother who had a very sick baby, the baby disappeared, and the mother said that a man came from a Volkswagen and knocked at the door, grabbed the baby and said, "This baby's not meant to live," and driven off in the Volkswagen. Police went down and they broke her the next day. The baby was sick, she couldn't stand it anymore, went to the banks of the Shoalhaven River and threw the baby over the cliff. The baby's body was found next day, half eaten by rats. The woman was taken away and she was put into a psychiatric institution, and that was it. You never heard anything more about it. She didn't go to a trial. And if this had been a case of infanticide, then that was, if Lindy had really been guilty of it, then it was a case of psychiatric treatment and so on. There was not the faintest motive. It was the core of the defence case. There was no motive, but she was portrayed as a murderess when what was killing her own baby without a motive, and that was that was the point. It was the whole thing went totally out of proportion.
You knew her quite well. You wouldn't describe her as a psychotic person, or
not the faintest evidence of any psychiatric instability in Lindy Chamberlain at all.